Silence isn't emptiness, it's memory. The body remembering what happened the last time words were offered and not held with care. You've seen this silence before, the kind that shows up after disappointment, after being misunderstood, after explaining yourself one too many times and realizing nothing actually changed. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal, like distance, like indifference, but underneath, something very different is happening. And here's what most people get wrong. They assume silence means absence of emotion, of care, of depth. Psychologists call this pattern emotional withdrawal, but that clinical name hides a deeper truth. This silence isn't a flaw, it's a survival strategy that once saved you. In this video, we're going to uncover the hidden psychology of people who go quiet when they're hurt. We'll trace it back to where it started, reveal why your nervous system chose silence over speech, and explore what it actually takes to feel safe enough to be heard again. The question isn't why some people go quiet. The real question is, what did they learn would happen if they didn't? Silence was never the first choice. No one is born believing their feelings are a burden, or that their voice doesn't matter. That belief is learned slowly, quietly, in moments that often look small from the outside. It begins when expressing yourself doesn't lead to understanding, when you explain how something hurt and you're told you're overreacting, when you share confusion and it's brushed aside, when you speak with honesty and the response isn't curiosity, it's defensiveness, dismissal, or silence in return. Over time, a pattern forms. Each attempt to speak carries a cost. Emotional exposure without safety, vulnerability without repair, and eventually the mind makes an adjustment, not out of weakness but out of self-preservation. If saying something creates tension, misunderstanding, or rejection, then maybe saying nothing is safer. But here's what makes this more complicated than it appears. This adaptation doesn't just happen once, it happens hundreds of times, in families where emotions were inconvenient, in relationships where needs were dismissed, in environments where being easy was rewarded more than being honest. The lesson isn't taught in words. It's taught in outcomes, and once that lesson settles into the body, silence stops feeling like suppression. It feels like control, like stability, like the least painful option available. What looks like withdrawal later in life is often just the echo of a moment long ago when being open didn't bring closeness, and quiet became the only way to stay intact. In psychology, emotional withdrawal is what happens when connection has become unpredictable, when closeness feels conditional, and expression feels risky. It's the mind and body stepping back, not because they don't want connection, but because they no longer trust it to be safe. There are important distinctions here. Some people withdraw temporarily, they go quiet to regulate, to think, to calm themselves before re-engaging. That kind of withdrawal is healthy. It's intentional, flexible, and reversible. But emotional withdrawal becomes something else when it turns chronic. Instead of being a pause, it becomes a position. The person doesn't just step back from a conversation. They step back from expectation, from hope, from the possibility that being understood is even available. Over time, withdrawal stops being something they do and becomes something they are. And that's when the real cost begins to show. But the psychology goes even deeper than learned behavior. For many people who go quiet, silence isn't a choice made by the mind at all. It's a response initiated by the nervous system before conscious thought even begins. When psychologists talk about survival responses, most people know fight or flight. But there's a third response that's far less discussed and far more misunderstood: freeze. Freeze happens when the system detects threat but doesn't see a safe way to escape or defend. The body stays still, energy drops inward, speech becomes difficult. Not because there's nothing to say, but because saying it feels unsafe at a physiological level. This is why so many people describe the exact same experience. They know exactly what they're feeling. They can articulate it clearly in their head, but the moment they try to speak, something locks up. The throat tightens, words vanish. It feels like being blocked from the inside. That isn't emotional immaturity, it isn't avoidance. It's a nervous system prioritizing survival over expression. In freeze, the body chooses containment. Staying quiet reduces the risk of escalation, reduces exposure, reduces the chance of emotional harm repeating itself. The system isn't trying to connect, it's trying to stay safe. And here's the part most people completely miss. Freeze is often learned in relational environments, not life-threatening ones. Chronic misunderstanding, emotional unpredictability, or repeated dismissal can train the nervous system to treat communication itself as a threat. So when silence appears, it isn't disinterest, it's regulation. A body remembering what happened the last time honesty was offered without protection, and deciding in that moment that quiet is the safest place to land. From the outside, this can look like emotional distance or lack of interest, but internally, the emotional system is often highly active. Thoughts are racing, feelings are intense, scenarios are replayed and analyzed. The person is deeply engaged, just not outwardly expressive, because expression at some point became associated with cost. Emotional withdrawal isn't the absence of emotion, it's emotion held too carefully, and that careful holding usually comes from experience. From learning that being open didn't lead to repair, only exposure. That explaining yourself didn't bring clarity, only more confusion. That showing how much you care made you vulnerable in ways no one protected. But there's something even more important to understand about the quiet ones. What most people never realize is how loud the inside of a quiet person really is. Silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It usually means everything is happening, just internally. These are people with constant inner dialogue. They replay conversations long after they end. They analyze tone, timing, and meaning. They ask themselves what they could have said differently, whether they were fair, whether they were too much or not enough. Their emotional world is active, layered, and often exhausting. They don't avoid feelings, they process them alone. Inside, there are explanations being rehearsed, emotions being named, connections being made. They understand their own experience with surprising clarity. But clarity inside doesn't always translate to expression outside, because speaking requires something more than understanding. It requires safety. When the inner world becomes the only place where feelings are allowed to exist, it grows louder over time. Thoughts pile up, emotions loop. There's no external release, no shared regulation. Everything has to be carried, sorted, and contained by one person alone. This is why quiet people are often misunderstood as distant or disengaged. From the outside, they seem calm, composed, hard to read, but internally they may be holding entire conversations that never make it into the room, and that disconnect takes a toll. Living with a loud inner world and a silent outer one creates tension, not because the person lacks emotional intelligence, but because their emotional intelligence has nowhere safe to go. Silence in this context isn't emptiness, it's compression, a life lived inwardly, not by preference but by necessity. And this leads us to one of the strangest paradoxes of emotional withdrawal. For someone who has learned to go quiet, silence isn't neutral. It feels safer, not because silence is comfortable, but because misunderstanding is painful in a very specific way. Being misunderstood doesn't just distort your words, it distorts who you are. Your intentions get rewritten, your emotions get reframed, and suddenly you're not only hurt, you're misrepresented. Over time, that kind of experience creates a quiet calculation. If I speak, I risk being twisted. If I stay silent, at least I won't be misread. Silence becomes a form of control, a way to limit damage, a way to keep your inner reality from being handled carelessly by people who don't know how to hold it. And here's something that rarely gets talked about. Society often rewards this silence. We call it being easy, being low maintenance, being mature. We praise people who don't make waves, who keep their feelings to themselves, who handle everything quietly without burdening anyone. But that praise comes at a cost. When being easy is rewarded more than being honest, people learn to shrink. They learn that their needs are inconvenient. They learn that the path of least resistance is the path of least visibility. And over time, being easy becomes a cage built out of approval. This connects to something even deeper. In a world that often measures worth by productivity and performance, staying quiet can feel like the only way to remain valuable. If you speak up, you risk being seen as difficult, emotional, too much. So you calculate, you perform competence while hiding confusion. You project stability while carrying chaos inside, and you start to believe that your value depends on how little you ask for. This is the paradox most people miss. Silence protects you from conflict, but it also prevents you from connection. By staying quiet, you avoid arguments, emotional escalation, and the exhaustion of explaining yourself. But you also forfeit the chance to be fully known. You trade the risk of being misunderstood for the certainty of being unseen. And at first, that trade feels worth it, because the pain of invisibility is quieter than the pain of misrepresentation. It doesn't erupt, it doesn't escalate, it settles into the background and becomes familiar. But safety built on silence is fragile. It keeps you regulated but isolated. What began as self-protection slowly becomes self-limitation. Not because you chose distance over closeness, but because closeness once came without care. And that brings us to perhaps the most confusing part of this pattern. One of the things that puzzles people most about those who withdraw emotionally is how inconsistent they can seem. One day they're warm, engaged, funny, fully present. The next they're distant, quiet, hard to reach. To others, this shift looks contradictory, even manipulative. But internally, there's nothing random about it. This isn't moodiness, it's capacity. When someone has learned to regulate themselves through silence, social engagement becomes an energy-intensive task. Being expressive requires safety, emotional bandwidth, and a nervous system that feels resourced enough to stay open. On good days, they have that capacity. They can show up, connect, and even shine. But that openness comes at a cost. After extended interaction, emotional exposure, or subtle tension, their system often needs to retreat to recover. Not because something went wrong in the moment, but because staying open for too long feels unsustainable. So the withdrawal follows. This is why they're often misread as cold or arrogant. People assume the distance is intentional, a message being sent, a judgment being made. In reality, it's regulation, not rejection. Their warmth wasn't an act, and their silence isn't punishment. It's the natural rhythm of a system that oscillates between engagement and protection, between connection and containment. What looks like inconsistency is actually self-preservation. They aren't pulling away because they don't care. They pull away because caring deeply requires more energy than their system can sustain continuously. And without understanding that rhythm, others only see the mask, not the cost of wearing it. The people who seem most unreachable are often the ones who care the most. They've just learned that caring without boundaries leads to exhaustion, and exhaustion over time leads to shutdown. But here's what no one tells you about staying quiet for too long. What keeps you safe at first doesn't always keep you free. Silence begins as protection, a way to avoid emotional harm, misunderstanding, and unnecessary conflict. But when it becomes the default response, something subtle shifts. The strategy that once preserved you starts to narrow your life. At first, the costs are easy to ignore. You feel regulated, stable, in control. There are fewer emotional explosions, fewer explanations that go nowhere. Quiet feels clean, manageable, but slowly the consequences accumulate. Connection thins, conversations stay surface level. People interact with a version of you that never fully arrives. And over time, a strange loneliness settles in. Not because you're alone, but because no one truly knows you. But there's an even deeper cost that most people never consider until it's too late. If you learned silence from the environment you grew up in, there's a real chance you're teaching it to someone else right now. Not intentionally, not dramatically, but quietly, in the way children learn everything. They watch how you handle conflict. They notice when you go still instead of speaking up. They absorb the unspoken rule that emotions are better kept inside. And without realizing it, the silence that once protected you becomes the inheritance you pass on. This is the paradox of emotional withdrawal. The walls that keep pain out also keep intimacy out. Needs go unspoken, boundaries stay implicit. Resentment has nowhere to move, so it turns inward. You begin to carry entire emotional experiences by yourself, not because you prefer independence, but because asking feels impossible. And perhaps the hardest part is this: the longer silence lasts, the harder it becomes to break. Expression starts to feel foreign. Vulnerability feels risky. Even when safe people appear, your system doesn't automatically recognize safety. It recognizes habit. What once protected you now confines you. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but quietly. The prison isn't built from isolation alone. It's built from adaptation that was never meant to be permanent. If any of this sounds like your experience, I want to hear from you. Type 1 in the comments if you've ever felt trapped by your own silence. Type 0 if speaking up has always come naturally to you. And if you're somewhere in between, tell me what that looks like. So where do we go from here? Healing doesn't begin by forcing yourself to speak. For someone who learned to survive through silence, the goal isn't to become louder, more expressive, or emotionally exposed overnight. That kind of pressure only recreates the very conditions that made silence necessary in the first place. Silence isn't the problem, unsafety is. What needs to change isn't your temperament. It's the environment around your expression. When silence formed, it did so because words weren't met with care. So healing begins not by abandoning quiet, but by redefining when and where it's no longer required. Safety in this context is specific. It's being listened to without correction. It's curiosity instead of defensiveness. It's space to speak without being rushed, minimized, or reinterpreted. And safety doesn't come all at once. It arrives in small moments. A response that doesn't escalate, a question asked without agenda, a pause that holds instead of interrupts. Over time, the nervous system starts to update its expectations. Expression no longer equals threat. Being seen doesn't automatically lead to harm. This is where silence shifts, not from shutdown to exposure, but from reflex to choice. You begin to notice when you're quiet because you want to be, and when you're quiet because you're afraid. And that awareness alone creates space, not pressure to perform vulnerability, but permission to test connection gradually, on your own terms. But here's something important that often gets overlooked. The same sensitivity that taught you to protect yourself is the same sensitivity that can guide you toward the people who are safe. You already know how to read a room. You already know when something feels off. You notice micro-expressions others miss. You sense tension before it's spoken. That's not a weakness. That's pattern recognition refined under pressure. The ability to go quiet kept you safe, but the awareness behind it, that heightened perception, can now help you find the people who won't require you to disappear. Your silence was never proof that something was wrong with you. It was proof that you were paying attention when no one else was. Silence doesn't need to disappear to make room for healing. It just needs somewhere safe to soften. Because when safety is present, words tend to return on their own. Not forced, not rehearsed, but finally free to land where they belong. Before we close, I'm curious where this message is reaching. Drop your country in the comments, whether you're in the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, or the Philippines. Let me know where you are. If you recognized yourself somewhere in this video, in the silence, the withdrawal, the careful holding back, there's something important you deserve to hear. You're not broken. You didn't miss a step everyone else learned. You adapted. What looks like distance today is often the residue of intelligence under pressure, a system that learned how to survive when connection didn't feel safe. And survival, even when it costs us something later, is never a personal failure. This isn't an invitation to suddenly speak more. It's an invitation to feel less alone in the quiet. Connection doesn't begin with explaining everything you've ever felt. It begins when your experience is understood without being argued with. When silence is respected, not interrogated. When presence doesn't demand performance, and those spaces exist, even if you haven't found them yet. You were never too much for staying quiet, and you were never too little for not speaking up. You were simply someone who learned that the world didn't always handle your words with care. And that's not a flaw, that's awareness. Silence doesn't have to be your only shelter. It was a bridge that got you here, and bridges aren't meant to be lived on forever. If any part of this resonated with you, I'd like to hear from you. You don't have to explain everything. A sentence is enough. Share your experience in the comments. Not to be fixed, not to be judged, but to be witnessed. Because connection doesn't always begin with words. Sometimes it begins with knowing you're not the only one who learned to be quiet to survive.